Go ahead and get started. My name is Ken Sheevy. I'm a political scientist here at Stanford, and I've just started a term as a director of the Europe Center. We have a somewhat of a four-legged relay of an introduction for you this morning, but I promise to at least sprint through the first leg of the relay. The main thing I want to do is thank everyone for agreeing to participate in the conference. I particularly want to thank our visitors and participants from Austria who've traveled a long way to participate in the conference. We're very excited to have you at today's interdisciplinary conference on migration and integration. I personally am fascinated by this topic because I think what the movement, one of the things that the movement of people does is it disrupts social equilibria. And whether we're talking about the economic environment that we're in, the political environment, or social environments, what the movement of people from a given, whether they're exiting or arriving from a given geographical location does, is it disrupts equilibria. And I think it's that disruption has been the focus across many different disciplines of very productive research. And each one of those disciplines is using their own set of tools to analyze that process, that disruption of a given social equilibrium. And I think those disciplines make a great deal of scientific progress in talking to each other. But one of the things that we want to do, and really a goal for, I think, the conference over the next couple of days, is to encourage an interdisciplinary conversation, to step back and look at what's going on across a number of different disciplines in studying how migration impacts the social equilibria that we're interested in. And so that's really the objective, or at least one of the objectives that I see for the next 2 days. As far as my introduction, and with that in mind, I'm ready to pass it off to our next speaker, which it's my pleasure to introduce the director of the Freeman Spogli Institute, Tino Cuellar.
Thank you very much. Good morning. It's a great honor and pleasure to welcome you to this conference. The Freeman Spogli Institute, which is where you're located, exists to build bridges across disciplines and to build bridges between Stanford and the rest of the world. But before I tell you why I'm particularly excited about this conference, I want to confess to you that I learned something from my kids this morning. I was walking them to school, and I was reflecting the kind of enthusiasm I feel for this conference. And I said to them that I was looking forward to going to work. And my 6-year-old looks up at me and says, "Why are you looking forward to going to work? That doesn't make any sense." And I explained that I was looking forward to this event that was going to happen this morning. And my daughter, who's 9, then chimed in and said, "What's so special about that event that's going to happen this morning?" And I said, "It's a conference." And my 6-year-old said, "Can I go?" And then my 9-year-old said, "No, you don't want to go. It's a conference. Conferences are boring." So at that point, I said to them, "You don't understand. This is actually going to be quite interesting." And my son said, "I'll tell you what's interesting, video games." And at this point, I don't know what got into me, but I started saying something to them which I was not expecting to say. I said, actually, a conference is a lot like a video game. You look at the situation in front of you, you respond as quickly as you can, and you see if you can go to the next level. So with that in mind, I want to tell you why I think we have the people in the room that might take us to the next level. As Ken was saying, few things are more potentially socially disruptive, more generative of political and economic change than migration. And we are meeting at a time when not only is it possible to see how different disciplines and different methodologies are rethinking the study of migration, but when a whole range of very dramatic policy issues are facing the world and are connected to migration. For our European colleagues, whom I'm very delighted and honored to work with, from the University of Vienna, of course, there is nothing unfamiliar about the challenges that are confronting Europe around issues of migration, how to think about migration across the European Union, but also from the outside world into the European Union. I want to highlight two other changes that I think are underway that are quite interesting and I hope will get some attention in our time together. One has to do with simply the dramatic growth in the refugee population in the Middle East, mostly from Syria, so we're talking about 2 million people, and probably no end in sight. Refugee camps in regions of the world where refugee camps are not unfamiliar, but where this new population and these new challenges are likely to create some tempest and uncertainty. Jordan, for example, is a place that, given the size of its own population, doesn't look at these changes without some grave concern. The other set of changes that I find particularly interesting are not so visible yet, I think, to policymakers around the world, but I think the trends are quite stark. And I'm talking about a shift in patterns of migration to middle-income countries, countries like Turkey and Indonesia and Mexico and Thailand, where certainly migration is not unfamiliar, but I think the numbers are changing. The amount of migration is accelerating, and particularly the amount of migration that ultimately ends up settling long-term in these countries. These are countries that for a great long time have been transit points as people go from one place to another, but for a variety of reasons I think are now attracting a population. And these countries, I think, in many respects are going to have to face the sorts of dilemmas that you are going to be confronting and thinking about in an academic context today. So I'm delighted to have the chance to share this conference with you. I'm glad to have such a stellar team to share the conference with, and I'm honored to have the partners and allies that we have from the University of Vienna. Stanford has been a university for many years, but it's a relatively young university. And we were just discussing yesterday how for a substantial chunk of Stanford's history, this collaboration with the University of Vienna has been part of our lives, and we look forward to continuing that. Thank you very much.
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, I'm happy to be here in Stanford after an incredible long flight from Vienna via Copenhagen. The cleaning personnel in Copenhagen was on strike, so therefore our departure was delayed. Some passengers, me too, we offered to clean the airplane by ourselves. I'm trained in cleaning my house, but the company does not accept it. So we arrived finally Stanford or San Francisco, but it was late. I'm happy to be here to strengthen the relation of our both universities. For my university, for the University of Vienna, international relation, student exchange, and research collaboration are extremely important and welcomed. I'm sure that students profit due to student mobility a lot. They recognize different cultures. They gain new insights into science and research. And maybe they established new networks going out of their own country. And the same profit is if research is collaborating. You can collaborate with the best researchers, you can select them, and you can compete with them for extra money. So we recognize in the University of Vienna the importance of being a truly international university as an instrument for quality assurance, and we do our best to follow this strategy. Today morning, I wake up at 2 o'clock in the morning and I thought about how successful we are in following this track of being an international universities, and I wrote some numbers. We have 92,000 students are enrolled in Vienna. That's a lot of number. That's a high number. 25% are non-Austrian citizens. And of these 25% non-Austrian citizen students enrolled in the University of Vienna, maybe half of them are from Germany, which can be expected because of more or less the same language. 1/3 is coming from other European countries, especially from our neighboring countries, and maybe the rest is coming from the rest of the world. Vienna is an attractive student place. Studying in Vienna is just for free, so it's not allowed for us to ask for tuition fees for by EU citizens, and only for third country nationals living outside, citizens of outside EU. But this number is 360 euro. That's maybe $300 per semester. So that's comparable cheap. And Vienna is a cheap place to live at all, I would say. From all new appointed professors, good morning. From all new appointed professors, 2/3 of them are non-Austrians. 2/3 of them have the last working place outside of Austria. Once again, the Germans are very important, but maybe half of this 2/3 newly appointed professors are coming from all other parts of the world. A quarter of our research money is not Austrian money, it's money from the EU, and this is an increasing number. So in Austria, we're not discussing how we have to initialize internationalization. Sometimes we have the discussion how we can stop further internationalization, or where are the limits of further internationalization. But I'm sure that the way will be not to increase pure numbers, we will increase, let's say, more the quality of some corporations, and maybe this example is a good example of increasing the quality. Final word, this conference picks up a very relevant issue. Especially in Europe, the traditional concept of a nation state with fixed borders, with a high autonomy of political decision power within the country, and a homogeneous population is still no longer valid. This is a picture of the 19th century, but the demise of the nation states is going step by step, and this demise of the nation state is not free of friction and right-wing repercussions. And migration is one of these processes. People are not stable in their borders, they are moving around, and the idea of having a homogeneous population is a fiction which is not holding true at that time. So therefore, I'm looking forward what our discussions, I hope so fruitful discussions about how we can manage migration, how we can manage integration, will end. I wish me and you and the conference interesting lectures, fruitful discussions, and the strengthening of our cooperations. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is August Reinisch. I'm a professor of international and European law and vice dean of the law school in Vienna. And a few years ago, our rector, university president, asked me to coordinate the cooperation our university has with Stanford University. This is, of course, something very special. Tino just mentioned that our role is substantial in times of the existence and duration of this university. Let me assure you that also for our university it's very important to have this kind of exchanges on multiple levels. Actually, it was in 1976 that Austria decided to give some substantial amount of money in order to enable Austrian professors, not only from our University of Vienna, but from any of the Austrian universities, to come for a semester or two and to teach at the various departments and schools here at Stanford. And that has been ongoing and has been something very successful. In addition to that, a few years ago, we developed a exchange program on an intermediate level, in the sense that this would allow also postdoc students, researchers to come similarly for a term of usually a semester to do their research and to engage in various cooperative enterprises with Stanford University. And then finally, this kind of setting, this conference, some of you are here for the first time and may wonder what that really is and how that works. It's an experiment every time. It has been very successful in the past. I'm sure it will be successful this time again. It started with a series of 3 conferences focusing on topics of post-World War II history in Austria and Eastern Europe. And after that, we had 2 years ago in Vienna, a conference focusing on human rights by my colleague Manfred Nowak, who I see here as well, and the Boltzmann Institute. And for today and for tomorrow, our colleagues here at Stanford organized something, again, more interdisciplinary, focusing on migration, on a topic, I think, when I just reflected coming here, that is very appropriate for academics, that could probably be described as a migratory species, not endangered at all, because they are spreading. When Tino spoke about his children, it reminded me what happened to me when I flew here yesterday. I picked up the phone in Frankfurt on the way to Stanford, and my daughter was asking whether she could drop by and leave her school bag. And I said, "Oh no, I'm on the way to Stanford, but can I bring you something?" So it's this kind of migratory life academics lead on a day-to-day basis probably explain what Hans-Peter Neuhold used to call wait a little, after a while you will become a corresponding member of your family. To explain, to become a corresponding member of the Austrian or any other European Academy of Science is the last step before really entering the Parnassus in the academic field. Now, what is this conference about? It's about migration, and it's about migration from different perspectives, and that is exactly the important point we try to bring together, and I want to particularly thank my colleagues here at Stanford, the predecessors of our speakers today, Amir Eschel in particular and Roland Schuh, in organizing this conference, and I look forward to 2 very exciting days of exchanges. Thank you very much.
I'm David Layton here at Stanford. Session 1 is investigating migration, new models for mobility and governance. I wonder if Heinz and Christoph can come up here and make believe we're part of the panel.
Name card.
So, see you again.
So,
I'm indifferent, but give the talks from up there.
Yeah.
So Heinz, why don't you start off?
There is some, yeah? Okay.
Everybody
Yes, ladies and gentlemen, once again, in my presentation, I will give you a short overview about the changing paradigm in migration and integration policy in Austria. Austria is here one example, but this example stands for other countries, for Germany, for the Netherlands, for Swiss. In all these countries, the old guest worker regime is placed more or less quickly by a new paradigm in which highly qualified migrants are in the core of interests. The new migration policy paradigm is accompanied by a focus on integration. Migrants are no longer seen as temporary migrants, as it was the case during the guest worker period. Now the welcomed migrants should be highly qualified, and they should be more or less a permanent part of the population. And Austria's policy at all is based on a new self-perception as an immigration country of a new type, which is a sensation because for many decades Austria said, we are not an immigration country. We have done it in the same way like Germany, ignoring the facts. About this, I will talk in 20 minutes. I start with a retrospect, the guest worker migration. Today, 2012, Austria is a small country. I have to excuse myself for this tininess. We have 8.4 million people, but we are increasing, strong increase. And if the demographic prognosis will be correct, we will catch up the 10 million threshold in the year 2040 or 2050, if all factors are going into that direction. This number of 8.4 million include 1 million foreign residents. These are 12% of the population, and a further 600,000 people which have something what we called in German migration background. I'm sure you have not the same concept, migration background. This is a concept asking the people, where are you born? If you're born outside the country, then you have a migration background. If you are born in the country, but your parents, father or mother, sometimes father and mother, were born outside, then you have a migration background as well. So together, 1 million foreigners by passport and 600,000 Austrian citizens by migration background. That gives 1.6 million migration background. And that's a relatively high percentage in Austria. We have an annual net migration of around 40,000 people. Net migration, positive net migration. Here in this figure, you see the net migration beginning from the 60s, though there are only very few years where the net migration is a negative number. In most years, the number is positive, though for statisticians, it was never a question that Austria is an immigration country. Half of the foreign citizens were citizens of the former Yugoslavian Republic and of Turkey, the traditional countries of the guest worker migration. The other half are from neighboring countries within the EU and some other third countries. The share of EU citizens in Austria is an increasing share. 7 minutes before I addressed the increasing number of German students in our university. This is part of the statistics. Vienna and Austria, I would say, expanded their catchment area, and to some extent the historical regions to say that Hungary, Slovakia, or Slovenia could be part of Austria. So a little bit a connection to the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy is emerging. The guest workers were seen as temporary, flexible, and low-qualified migrants, filling the gaps in a segmented labor market. Guest workers, this was the idea, should come when the economic cycle is demanding new labor, and they should leave when there are no vacant jobs at the market. We called it rotation principle. And the rotation principle means people are coming and going, And the question which integration policy are necessary for these people, this was a question which was not relevant because the people are very, very flexible. But this idea of rotation principle failed. It failed due to two different positions. The entrepreneur said, why I should always employ a new guest worker? It always produce new learning costs, and that is not the best for me. And the guest workers themselves said, I feel good in Austria. I have a relatively high income job. Why I should leave the country when the next cycle came into effect. So the rotation principle failed to some extent, and from migration as a time migration became a permanent migration. Especially when the first oil price shock came, 1973, and the government said there is a recruitment stop, so people, it's not allowed to hire new guest workers. Then the former relation to have a flexible working force disappeared completely, because the recruitment ban was a clear signal: if you now leave the country, you will never have a chance to go back. So since 1973, there is a clear change of a flexible temporary migration regime to a more permanent migration regime. What is the legacy of this guest worker migration? The legacy is ambiguous, especially when we're looking at the economic effects. The low qualified migrants help the labor-intensive sectors like tourism, construction, service sectors to survive on a short run without doing any structural reforms, without any investments. The low qualified and low paid workers offered the possibility for the entrepreneurs to avoid investments in capital intensive and labor saving investments. When the labor is cheap, the entrepreneurs do not see any necessity to invest in machines. It's quite cheaper to employ people. In general, guest worker migration was not the best strategy to have a competitive economy. And in German we say guest worker migration led to something what we call structural conservation, Strukturkonservierung, structural conservation of this type of migration. What is with the social and demographic legacy? The low qualified but migration from countries like Turkey and Yugoslavia brought a young population which is clearly a gain for an aging society, and the Austrian population is an aging society. The migrants showed a higher fertility pattern, at least for the first generation, and this can also seen as a positive effect of the guest worker migration. On the other hand, guest worker constituted a new underclass defined by ethnic and social variable. This new social underclass is concentrated in cities and within the cities in certain quarters. The fear of the majority population that something like a parallel society is emerging is obvious. And what it makes the legacy much more ambiguous is that on the long run, on that situation, nothing real changed. The first generation was low qualified, and the second and third qualification is as well low qualified. They are showing, they are underperformer in our school system. The percentage of dropouts in the school is higher than of other groups. And the second generation, what came additionally, when they marry or when they marry, sometimes, or not only sometimes, they bring their family members from the home countries into Austria, and the integration process started once again and once again. So there is a persistence of this ethnic and social class, which produces some concerns, not only in the population. This is the wonderful age structure of the Austrian population that's above. You see, this is an aging population, which broad shoulders of 60+ years old population, and down you see the migrant population, which is a concentration in younger age groups. So maybe from a demographic standpoint, that's the best results when I try to make something like a legacy of the guest worker migration. Due to this ambiguous legacy, the Austrian government decided, as I announced at the beginning, decided to change the paradigmatic core of the migration policy. One main element is limitation of the migration and privileges for high qualified ones. This limitation is not so easy. To limit the number of new migrants, Austria tried and try to be less attractive for newcomers, especially, or for example, for family reunification. It's not so easy, because behind the family reunification there are the lawyers and our legal system providing the right of family life. Nevertheless, the government decided some measurements which are showing we want to be less attractive for family reunification. One measurement is to limit the degree of kinship. So who is part of the family? That's clearly answered. It's only the children and the husband or the wife. Children are defined up to 18 years. And 19 years old children is not a children in that respect. My children are 25 and they are my children, that's clear. But in that respect of family reunification, they have to be younger than 18. Spouses are eligible to travel to the anchor person when he or she is older than 21. So you can be married with an, let's say, 70 years old girl, but it's not allowed for you to bring them to Austria, because it's only allowed when she is 21. This is a measurement clearly to avoid arranged marriages, to make it less attractive due to marriage migration to come to Austria. Before entering Austria, spouses have to prove German language competence at the A1 level. You know, in Europe, everything is standardized, also the language capacity. So we have A1, A2, B1, B2, C1, C2. I do not want to explain it because I'm not a specialist in that respect. A1 is, that means I can ask where is Stanford University or where I have to go to reach this. 1 minute. Oh my God, then I have to. Can I have a little bit more than 1 minute? Other signals are sent to potential asylum seekers to limit the overall migration. Asylum migration should not be the backdoor to labor migration or to migration to the labor market. So a strict execution of the Geneva Convention is in that respect a measurement, speed up of the procedure, and say to the people relatively early, you have no chance to receive asylum status. And in contrast to this more negative signals, a positive signals was sent out to the highly qualified. 2011, Austria introduced something what we called red, white, red card. Our flag is red, white, red. And this is an instrument, an umbrella instrument for different groups of migrants to attract them. One problem I have to address very shortly because I have now only 4 minutes. If we say we want to steer or to channel or to manage migration, it's difficult for Austria, which is part of the European Union, to make it. Because you see here these persons, and the longest row, are the migrants from EU. We have no chance to limit EU migration. We have no chance to limit the return of the Austrians. That would make no sense to limit the own population. So we have only a chance with all these instruments like red, white, red card to limit third country nationals. And this is only a small part of the overall migration. Nevertheless, the red, white, red card is a clear signal for the skilled persons. You are invited to come to Austria, especially if you are IT technician, if you are qualified craftsman, and if you have a job offer in Austria, then you can come if you have 50 out of 100 points. If you are in a good age, if you have work experience, and if you are able to speak German, then you are invited. Or if you are really high qualified, that means you reach 70 points out of 100, which is a high number. I have no chance to reach 70 out of 100 because of my age. Age is a very crucial factor. Then I can come to Austria without any binding job offer. This is a revolution in the whole migration history of Austria, to come into the country without a job, without a binding job offer. And finally, students are invited. Students are coming. They have to prove that they can survive for the first semester. And after the first semester, they have to earn their own money. But we invite students to come because students could be the ideal immigrants. They are studying, they are high qualified, they are speaking German, and they should stay after graduation. That's important. 10 years ago, we sent them all back to avoid brain drain. Now we invite them to stay in Austria. That is the red, white, red card. You see, that's how it looks like here. And these are the ministers in charge who are very proud to present the red, white, red card. With the red, white, red card, and that's the second pillar of the change of the paradigm of our migration policy, integration policy was set up. That was new because for many decades, as I said before, guest workers were not seen as immigrants, so integration measures are not necessary. That was also the reason why our Freedom Party, a right-wing party, gained so many elections, because the official standpoint of the government was there is no integration questions. These are guest workers, and a good guest is a person who comes and goes. 2005, the government recognized this is not a good strategy to ignore integration issues, because it makes open the success for right-wing parties. They start to make something like an integration policy. The first measurement was a so-called integration contract for newcomers. They have to learn German within a certain time, and if they failed the test of the German test, then it could be that the residence permission will be declined, but this is a very rare case. Another important thing was 2009, the government said we have to make a national integration plan, a very systematic plan, which measures are important to bring the people into the heart of society. So preschool education, becomes very important and is now obligatory for those kids who are showing some language deficits. The next target is to avoid the school leavers, dropouts, because without any formal certification after the end of your school career, there is no chance to have a job. Furthermore, in that national integration plan, measurements were installed that diplomas from third countries are more easy recognized by our administration, so that the doctor or diploma engineer driving or earning the money as taxi driver should be a rare case. So a lot of things were done 2009 in that national integration plan. In 2011, they implemented a specific state secretary for integration. Before it was a subject of the Ministry for Interior Affairs, then comes a state secretary for integration. So integration policy became a phase. A lot of the policy is symbolic, but important for the people is that there is a person who is dealing or is managing this issue. An annual monitoring system, statistical monitoring system is implemented to look how is integration going on in the population. And an annual integration report is published as well to show where are the deficits in that respect. Here, that's the young man is the state secretary for integration. The older one, that's I am, by presenting this integration report every year. You have not to show your card. I came to my conclusion. Austria became an immigration country not by its own decision, but by the factual development. But since the 1960s, migration policy was driven only by the interests of the unions, a representative of employers, and it was a policy orientated by the needs of the labor market. And an integration policy which goes hand in hand with a migration policy was not existing. We, the science or the researchers, geographers, demographers, always said Austria will need some migration because of a simple demographic development. We have a total fertility rate from 1.4, which is not enough to reproduce the population. So if the economy is stable, or if the economy is increasing, it's absolutely necessary to stabilize the labor force. Therefore, migration is the only way to bring people in. But we always said it's necessary to make a comprehensive migration and integration policy. What we observed is that there is the clear change of our policy. The slow boring of hard boards showed some success. Das langsame Bohren der dicken Bretter. It showed some success, but it's difficult to change everything immediately. Bureaucracy, administration, and the public opinion. Nevertheless, I'm quite optimistic that the new idea of managing migration and integration will have some success. Thank you very much.
Christoph?
Put in my
Yes, my plate.
They know who you are.
Yes.
normally. Yeah, yes.
Interesting.
She had
Okay.
police force. They have the uniform, but no.
Oh, this works. So thank you very much for this technical support. Thank you very much for this organization of this conference, of this meeting. It's really a big pleasure to be here and to have this opportunity. I will, Heinz Fassmann, he talked about third country national migration and the policy. I will focus on another aspect, which is very important for the Austrian and the European situation, that we have a European Union in increasing integration process, and within this integrated Europe area, we have migration. We call it today not migration, we speak about mobility. Heinz, he spoke about migration. Of course, he showed the tables, but I would like to focus on this aspect of inter-European mobility, taking the Central European region as an example, and I will focus I will tell about the project we are working on since 1 year, and we recently got the first data, and we'll present some data on this research on this topic. So, you know maybe the Stephen Castle's quotation. He said once that temporary migration meets a permanent labor demand, and this is the case also within the European Union. That means that we have regional labor markets where we have labor demand, and it is not necessarily the third national migrant who is responding to this demand. It is an ongoing process of an inner European migration or mobility process, and this is what I'm focusing on. I would like to say at the beginning that what I'm telling on is a cooperative, a collective work. I'm working together with Roland Verwiebe, it's a colleague of mine in the Department of Sociology, and two young fellows, Raimund Heindorf and Laura Wiesberg. We're working on a project. It's financed by the Research Fund of City of Vienna, and the project is called Cross-Border Labor Mobility, Transnational Labor Markets and Social Differentiation in the Central European Region. And this is my structure of the presentation. I will speak some words about cross-border mobility in Europe. I will take Central European region as an example. I will present our project, and then I will present some empirical findings. And there are 3 points I will focus on. One is, who is commuting? Second is, what makes commuters successful? And third is, does cross-border mobility enhance subjective well-being? And finally, some concluding remarks. So, why speak about mobility processes and maybe not so much about migration? We are in the European Union, and in the European Union we have a free movement, a principle, 5 principles, and one of the main principles is the free movement of people, and that includes that EU citizens can move freely between member states to live, to work, to study, to retire in another country. Of course, you will see later, I will find my final conclusions will focus on that even in this region I speak on, this is not the case for everybody. But it is a main principle since the 2004, and even in, as you can see, Treaty of Maastricht. Since the mid-1990s, but not before, since mid-1990s, we have indeed an increasing inter-European mobility. That means that people are moving for reason of work to another country. That does not mean that they move permanently, but they move for reason of work. And we have increasing inter-European migration, and there are, and this is very important, institutional frameworks. For example, the Euros. The Euros means this the offices, the national offices of labor management, labor Arbeitsmarkt service, services for labor, labor market organizations, and they are created on a European level, and they enhance they try to enhance the labor, the mobility of workforce. And one aspect which is very important, that indeed, as Heinz already mentioned, this new inter-European mobility and migration process is mainly, how to say, here it's written middle class. I would say they're more or less qualified individuals are mobile. They are in that way middle class migration, and they are not necessarily, as we had it in the guest worker tradition, less educated, less qualified persons. Third point, there is a very important relevance of regional labor markets. So what we can observe is there's of course migration, in the sense of somebody from, I don't know, Denmark goes to Portugal, or in the other way around. But we have, especially in some regional, in some regions, very important mobility processes. And I quote here four: Northern Europe, Baltic countries, the Benelux and Luxembourg area, and the Central European region. And there you have a picture, because it's not so, maybe not so, you're not so familiar. Central European means this is a region, Centrope, it's called Centrope. It's a kind of institution, a framework. 4 countries tried to bring together interests, and it was created in 2003, and the countries are Czech Republic, Slovak Republic, Hungary, and Austria. In this southern, western, or eastern part of these 4 countries. The central cities are Vienna and Bratislava. We have around 7 million residents in this area, and it is a quite interesting area because it is an area where the transnational migration, I'm quite critical to this notion, but I will use it for the moment, has a very long and contradictory tradition. This is the area of the Austrian-Hungarian monarchy. That means we have a long and varied tradition of migration, regulated, non-regulated, short-term, long-term, officially recorded, and informal. And this is, so to say, something which structures this region. Since the enlargement of the European Union in 2004, the neighbor countries of Austria, which are now part of the Central region, are members of the European Union, and since 2011 there's this fully freedom of settlement and of work, and these temporary regulations have been finished. So, and we can maybe use this definition of Portes and colleagues. What is a transnational labor market? And he says, transnational labor market is a labor market that constitutes occupations and activities that require regular and sustained social contacts over time across national borders for their implementation. Recent research shows that there are remaining regional disparities in economic wealth and development. Cross-border commuting is a strategy to overcome local labor and market constraints. It's evident. Secondly, there is a diverse and selective migration pattern. So we have short-term migration, we have permanent migration of highly skilled, we have seasonal commuting process in the, for example, agricultural sector and tourism, we have cyclical commuting in care. There are relevance of social demographic variables like age, gender, family, and so on, and there's importance of informal networks and regional familiarity, which is quite evident because you have to know the space where you are moving in. And to give some proof for this, what I quoted from former research, from our research, we find some evidences, for example, that you have on the left side the cross-border commuters, on the right side non-commuters, and of course you see that cross-border commuters use much more often social networks for finding a job. This is only to underline what also recent research has found. So our research had two main interests. One is, what are main factors in explaining cross-border commuting practices in this particular region? The role of human social capital and so on. And the second is, what are the effects of cross-border commuting in terms of achieving a better socio-economic status and subjective well-being? And the translab data, as you can see, we used this ethno-survey methodology. We had two samples. One was a local sample in the eastern border regions of the eastern countries, and one of commuters, people who commuting to Austria. So, and the fieldwork was quite recently done. So here's our theoretical model. It is the model of Massey he used for Mexican migration to the States. We added here the aspect of labor market characteristics and social democratic backgrounds, but maybe we'll have time to discuss this later. So what are the findings? I have not so much time, so I try to focus on the main thing. One is, who is commuting? This is not very surprising. These are more younger persons, rather men than women. It is in construction sector, gastronomy, health services, and there are people with professional skills and no less than a medium educational level. This we can find. Secondly, now, what makes commuters successful? And I will switch immediately to the second column, because for time reasons. The left column is job finding via networks. So it was to discuss which role do weak ties and so on play for finding a job in this region. And we can see, yes, they play a quite important role, but there are some interesting aspects in it, in these findings. Maybe it goes it's not the place here to discuss, for example, that education has a contradictory influence and so on. But interesting, of course, is that if you look on the right column, earnings, the outcome, that means we've confirmed in our research what we found in other researches, that people with low educational skills will earn less, and people with high will earn more, and so on and so on. The interesting point here is that you go down the column, you will see firm size, self-employment. These are two aspects which play a very important role. That means we have a region where we have a dominance of smaller firms. If you are in a smaller firm, the probability, the likelihood to get a better income is quite smaller. And especially this is the case for self-employment. And I like to focus on that, because this is an effect of the regulations the Austrian government developed for the period after the entrance of the countries into the European Union. Because Austria said, as most all the other countries expected, UK and Sweden and so on, they said, okay, it's a burden for our labor market, for our local labor market. We are afraid that too many people will come. We will restrict the entrance to the labor market, with one exception, if people have their own enterprise. So people were encouraged to create their one-person individual enterprise, and they are, so we can call them the losers in this play. And now the third finding, does cross-border mobility enhance subjective well-being? And what we can find is, quite interesting, yes, on the bivariate level, we find that commuters are more satisfied than non-commuters. And if you look at on a more complex, on a multivariate label, we have here two models. And if you look on different variables, and you have commuting within, in the first model, where we have not included the income, the commuting explains to a very high degree or to a strong degree or is a predictor of well-being. But if we include income, it is not. And this is very interesting because this means that commuting itself, of course, is not a target, an objective. The objective is to gain income and to improve your wealth. So, and if you are forced to, for example, like the self-employed people or people who are in the very informal market, like in the tourism or gastro, or in the construction sector, where you're forced to pick up what you get, so to say, and where you're less well paid, there, of course, this will be a problem in that way. You cannot sustain your economic wealth as you maybe want to do. So I have 3 points for the discussion. One is, I might end. One is translate research, strengthen hypotheses, cultural capital, social capital, serve as key factors in finding a job and for success. And it also focuses on the relevance of biographical, of migration experience. That's what we know. The second point is, that seems for me more interesting, research results reflect the fact that commuting may increase life satisfaction. At the same time, it emphasizes the complex relation between migration and well-being. Commuting should not be considered as an ultimate purpose. Economic wealth, as an indicator of labor market integration, represents a necessary condition of well-being, though certainly not a sufficient one, of course. And third one, this for me, it was one of the most important outcomes of this first step of the project. The translate research points out the necessity to keep in mind the complexity of transnational labor market. For me, it even questions the notion of transnational labor in that case, in that concrete case. Commuting in Central region is very selective due to gender, to age, to skills, but also highly impacted by institutional traditions, regulations, and local micro labor markets, characteristics and constraints. And here maybe we come to this discussion and to link it also what Heinz told us, that there are new law and policy issues, and what we learn maybe later on the Roma, are appearing with regard to the precarious situations of vulnerable groups. For example, European citizens, women in informal care, or Roma, Romnia. Roma, Romnia are European citizens, but if they go to work in eastern part of Austria, they get huge problems. No? They have no right to stay, the police will try to bring them out, and populations are against, and so on. So this is what the 3 points maybe for discussion. Thank you very much. These are the thank you in the 4 countries. Köszönöm, Dziękuję, dziękuję, danke.
So let me begin with an apology. My language and area ignorance of Austria and Central Europe is profound. My PhD advisor, Ernst B. Haas, born in Central Europe, wrote a seminal book on the uniting of Europe. And in response, I did my dissertation on Somalia. So take my ignorance into account in discussing these 2 papers, which give a vital, I think, current information on the demographics and policy of migration in Austria and Central Europe. Let me start with Heinz's paper, Rethinking Migration Policy in Austria. The paper, as you've heard, is a description of the changes in Austria from a guest worker paradigm to an integration paradigm. The guest worker paradigm began in the 1960s and appeared at the time to be a rational response to cyclical labor shortages that could be filled by importation and rotation of foreign workers. The secondary consequences, as you've heard, of this policy paradigm were many: lower investment in labor-saving capital equipment, industry on angry about losing trained workers, defiance of the rotation laws with complicity of government and unions, leading to ethnic enclaves that were permanent but stood outside the Austrian social and political community. Yet learning by policymakers that the program was a failure took more than a decade. Well, from the United States perspective, that's pretty fast, I guess. Took more than a decade, and only after some social upheaval manifested by rather ugly political strands that were threats to liberal society. These social upheaval by the autochthonous population threatened by a growing foreign presence in their country. The new paradigm, as we've heard, is radically different. It accepts Austria as a permanent home to immigrants. It demands linguistic assimilation that will allow fuller participation in Austrian political, economic, and social life. And it gives preference to skilled workers, setting limits to family reunification, and it's not immediately granted. This paper reflects support for this change and hope that it will successfully transform Austria, saving its social security regime, making the country dynamically competitive, and introducing more cultural diversity to a population in accord with what Heinz calls a more pluralistic world. So I only have one question. How will we know if this policy is successful? And how long will it take Austria to learn if the unintended secondary consequences of the policy are as problematic as they were for the guest worker regime? Suppose, as a policy recommendation to the Ministry of Integration, we offer a learning mechanism into this paradigm. We would learn two things. Does a point system awarding the red, white, red cards lead to the most productive new members of a new Austrian society compared to the status quo? We're just assuming that, or hoping for it, I guess. And second, does the new paradigm reduce the anti-immigrant fervor among the autochthonous Austrians? We're just assuming that as well, or hoping. How would you implement this, this learning mechanism? Well, you can complement the red, white, red criteria with a lottery system and do a panel survey on the economic and social success of each group. Then you would actually have a comparison group brought in at the same time, but under different criteria, and that you'd be able to have a learning mechanism over time. Second, and this is more in reflection of recent work by Raffaella Danziger at Princeton and Cora Wernby at Uppsala, randomly assign immigrant municipalities with an assured membership in the city council for red, white, red cardholders with a vote in municipal councils, and compare through surveys local levels of anger, violence, autochthonous voting patterns, and municipal policy on how integration is affecting wider acceptance of the integration policy. Danziger argues that the more there is representation, the violence will be less against the autochthonous, against the immigrants, and more against the state. The anger will be transferred to the state rather than to the immigrants. And Wernby argues that the more they're in the council, the more social services that are blind to social economic status will be passed. So we would actually have a real test if we could randomize the municipalities in terms of the representation they get of red, white, red cardholders. My point is this is a fantastic opportunity to develop a learning mechanism into a new social policy rather than basing it strictly on hope. We know from the guest worker paradigm that the best laid plans of social planners often go awry, and we need to build in a learning mechanism to social policy if we're ever going to get it right. So the hope of this reform ought to be complemented by a monitoring mechanism to see if it's meeting its very high goals. Christoph's paper on transnational mobility, a way of enhancing social economic status and subjective well-being, question mark. This is a study of Centrope region, as you saw, made up of 4 countries centered around Vienna and Bratislava. And several questions are addressed in this presentation, and the paper I read, the presentation went beyond what I read and was very interesting. First, how does the trans-border job allocation system work for both commuters and settlers? And we're finding a wide use of informal social networks rather than formal job application processes for both highly and low-skilled job seekers. Second, who are these cross-border commuters? Well, we learned the people with professional skills and no less than a medium education level. That's one set. In construction sector, gastronomy and health services, younger persons, and rather men than women. This is from the regression analysis. The big question was to investigate, quote, the effects of cross-border commuting in terms of achieving a better social economic status and subjective well-being. So what have we learned so far from this, as he said, very early stages of data collection? Well, on earnings, I was surprised to learn it's better to be Hungarian than Czech. On satisfaction, it's better to speak German. Although one close friend of mine, an Italian, said if you actually speak Italian in Italy, you'll realize what they're saying about you, so it's better to be ignorant of the language. And for satisfaction, without any controls, it's better to be a commuter rather than a permanent settler. The last point in the conclusion, if I can be a little bit nasty, the TransLab research points out the necessity to keep in mind the complexity of transnational labor markets. This is a ploy used by all academics. This conclusion can be used in any topic that social science investigates, because the world is more complex than we'll ever understand, and the purpose should be to reduce that complexity in order to understand some outcome that concerns us, rather than merely to report the complexity as a finding. At this point in the research, at least as reflected in the slides, the project seems to me to be highly undermotivated. When Mark Granovetter did his seminal work on Who Gets a Job, it was motivated by the recognition that there was systematic discrimination in the American job market sustained by social networks. Solving the problem of inequality was motivating that research. Controlling for skills, people without the right social networks were not getting the jobs. And this was a major problem to be solved, and a wonderful use of social network analysis. And that was a highly motivated research project using this. And so I found it difficult to think about relatively different degrees of social well-being. Am I happy, am I not so happy, as being sort of motivating important social science analysis. But suppose we pick on one, wasn't quite a finding because it got washed away in a more multivariate analysis. The satisfaction for commuters rather than settlers. You picked on this more on your talk than it was in the paper, and I picked it up on it as well. Even controlling for education, age, gender, and language facility, and job quality, this preference for commuting still holds. And I would say anyone who's lived in Europe knows that people will commute, especially in France, 250, 300 kilometers to their job if they can live in the single-digit arrondissement in Paris. So it's not only interstate, but it's intrastate commuting. This would show that the fully integrated job market in the EU remains elusive, and that optimal allocation of labor is constrained by strong preferences to be housed within the boundaries where one's grandparents grew up. This remains true in Europe, and it's fundamentally different from America. If we could estimate the macro costs of this suboptimal allocation of labor in the EU, this finding might be motivated in a more compelling way than we saw in the slides. In any event, I'd be interested in hearing more about the motivation behind this project and what major social issue the data will help us address. I think, I have no authority to do this, but I think we have time for questions, and stop maybe in 10 or 15 minutes, giving you a chance to talk amongst yourselves, which is probably the most useful thing in these conferences. In which case,
Heinz, I have a question for you. You know, I live in a, despite my accent, I live in a country that is struggling with migration, EU membership. I live in England, or the UK. And the challenge of, if you want to, as a policy, restrict migration and you're part of the EU, the portion that you can actually restrict is quite small. And then efforts that are taken to reduce numbers, you know, often have counterproductive outcomes. And in the UK, the kind of a broader reaction that we're seeing at the moment is one of, well, maybe we don't want to be in the EU, in part because of the inability to restrict migrants from other parts of the EU. And I'm just curious, in Austria, is there a similar groundswell occurring? And do you see any potential for government or groups in Austria to try to rethink or redo the EU model as it relates to free movement of people?
No, we have the same situation, that's correct. The share of immigrants which could be addressed by national policy is decreasing and decreasing. In Austria, and I know it in Germany, this is taken for granted. These are EU citizens. Nobody would, oh yes, not nobody, that's too less. Some of them are thinking about, should we leave the EU, but this is a really small minority in the population as well by the politicians. So that's different to the UK. Nobody would think about, due to that case, we should leave the EU. To some extent, is the red, white, red card a symbolic instrument? Because the pure number is, we have 140,000 immigrants each year. With the red, white, red card, maybe 2,000 people are brought in the country. So it's a symbolic action. Nevertheless, symbolic policy is an important policy. And it clear signals to the people, we are interested in the talents of the world. We want to bring the brightest and the best one to Austria. And this is important to change opinion in the people. We are not the country which takes every person. We are now a country which takes only the best and the brightest. And you're asking more rhetorically, when the red, white, red card is a success or became successful. The answer would be if the question of migration and integration disappear as a hot political issue. If migration and integration policy is taking like a normal policy measurements, not producing concerns in the population, then it will be a success. And I'm optimistic and will say, yes, in the last 3 years, if the politicians are willing something, they want to do something, yes, they can do it, and we are on a good track.
I'm a visiting professor here at Europe Center and also a professor at Comenius University in Bratislava. What I've been experiencing since 2006 until 2009, I was a commuter between Bratislava and Vienna, so I'm happy to stand as an object for your colleagues, fill out some of the questionnaires. But my question would be, and I find it really interesting, what Mr. Frankfurt was saying about the satisfaction of commuters. I'm not sure if I was going to confirm that same finding about the actual satisfaction of commuting. What I wanted to push you a little bit about or suggest 2 other factors that may be of interest, structural factors in your analysis, and that is what kind of an impact would you have of the infrastructure that's available for commuting between the two countries? Because if you have between the countries in the region, if you look at Vienna and Bratislava, over the years between 2006 and 2009, you had an immense improvement in the infrastructure. That includes the highway, where you can drive in 45 minutes. That wasn't there. That includes the Eurozone entry of Slovakia, which has the same currency now. So that kind of thing is maybe of interest, because if you look at then the infrastructure that's available between Vienna and Brno, for instance, in the Czech Republic, that's much worse. I mean, it takes 3 hours to drive to Brno, while it takes 45 minutes to drive to Bratislava. And the same goes for Hungary. So I wonder what kind of an effect that has. And the second factor I was wondering about was, what about the outflow of immigrants from Slovakia, settlers from Bratislava, who actually remain working socially connected in Bratislava, but they settle in the villages and the towns around Austria, because it's cheaper to buy a house in Hainburg or Kitze across the border in Austria than to buy it in Bratislava. So what is that effect? And they of course get all the social benefits of the Austrian social system because they're settled in Austria, but they remain working in Bratislava, their kids go to school in Bratislava, and so on. So, what is that? Did you think about those aspects as well in your future project?
Shall I?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think this infrastructural dimension is very important. And this explains why Hungary and we have it in another way, why the Czech Republican, the commuters from Czech Republic have a lower level of income and a lower level of satisfaction. And this is why we have a different structure of commuters, because commuting is, of course, the opportunity structure of commuting is very important. And there are two very relevant aspects. One is with Hungary. With Hungary and Western Hungary and Eastern Austria, the commuting experiences go back to the 1980s, even longer. So that means even under the old state socialist regime, we had commuting arrangements, so to say, labor market in overlapping processes. And this, of course, has an effect. And the second is, and this was not the case in Czech Republic and Czechoslovakia, so to say. And as you said, what differentiates Slovak situation from Czech is the better infrastructural situation. That means people have much more easier to commute to Vienna or to the other smaller towns and villages on the road to Vienna from Bratislava. This is not the case in the northern region of Austria. So this is very important, and I had not the time to go deeper into, but this we can improve. The other question you put into in now, we will do work on this in the next step. So we have a next step which is more in qualitative one. We go to the villages where people are not only commuting to, but also living, because this was very difficult to get people in the survey. And so we do it in the next step. But this, I think, is a very interesting point you focused on. Thank you.
Yeah.
I have a question concerning the Central European labor market and the mobility more generally. In Austria, to what extent do you have citizens from EU countries immigrating to Austria, settling there, or taking jobs on a temporary basis, who are not from this region? That is, how many French are there, how many Spaniards, and so on?
Most of them, Heinz has the data precisely, I'm sure, but the most from Germany. So the most from the inter-European migration, the most important numbers are from Germany. And then, of course, from the Central European regions. But recently, the most increasing numbers of immigrants come from Germany. But you have certainly the...
Two-thirds of the annual inflow is an EU inflow. And of that two-thirds, I would say two-thirds are from Germany, and one-third are from Poland, Hungary, or Slovakia.
So that really makes David's point even stronger. That is, even if you have real inflows, non-commuting inflows, there is still the cultural dependency or the comfort being in your own culture that matters so much.
Yeah, but not always culture explains everything. Sometimes it's if Lufthansa is opening a branch or a new headquarter in Vienna, then the managers are going with. That's not culture, that's economy.
We have also from Eastern German parts commuters to Austria, especially in the tourism industries, where people from this part coming for seasonal migration to Austria. And they replaced the former, for example, Czech or Slovak immigration to these areas. So there's a bigger change.
I very much enjoyed both presentations and David's comment as well. I wanted to just make one observation and then ask a question of Heinz. The observation is that in the American context, questions of immigrant integration are extraordinarily fragmented bureaucratically. And they're fragmented both at the level of the federal government, so there are at least 4 different government agencies involved, but also very heavily fragmented because of the federal structure of the United States. So I'll give you an example. California has about 2 million community college students. And in many respects, community colleges in California serve as hubs for immigrant integration, just simply defined by places where immigrants go to learn English. But community colleges are funded almost entirely by the state of California. So while the Supreme Court of the United States may say immigration policy is a national matter, and there's a legal basis for saying that, as a practical matter, decisions that the state of California makes about the funding structure for community colleges, open access higher education, are likely to have huge effects on immigrant integration. So that's just an observation. The question for Heinz has to do with, I think, an interesting potential tension between the way David was thinking about the goals of immigration policy and the way implicitly you were. I think from David's perspective, the focus on trying to measure outcomes, which I think is great when we can do it, reflects a sense that immigration policy is going to have impacts, can have impacts on labor markets, on politics, on local conditions, and so on. And you emphasized, when you were talking about what you hope to see from this shift, political changes. And so that led me to want to ask you a little bit about what policymakers felt they were going to achieve when they instituted the red card. And so whether, in a sense, your summary of what you think the goal is reflected in what policymakers were trying to achieve, or whether the goals were broader, maybe about economics and not just about politics.
Sure. The goals are mainly, on the one hand, the economy said we want to have a flexible, qualified labor market, and we want to avoid to pay too high wages. That's on the one side. On the other side, we have the strong unions. They say the labor market should be exclusively reserved for Austrians or for the population which is living in Austria. These are the two traditionally fundamental interest groups which are now trying to make it, that's the part of the policy, that's a part of the political process in Austria, they try to make a consensus, how much we can open it and how much we can avoid the openness of the labor market. When the red, white, red card and the migration policy is successful, I said it before, if this issue disappeared from the daily newspaper, if it's just a normal way of feeding economy and of guarantee the reproduction of the population. And the other observation I would stress out is integration policy is a policy which is important in most of the European countries. My experience in the US, integration policy, it's not only fragmented, it's not existing to some extent. And the reason behind is you have nothing to distribute. You have no social welfare to distribute, or a little bit social welfare to distribute. The fear in Austria is, and in Germany, who is getting the social welfare? And the answer is people which are part of the population and integrated part of the population. People which are coming, taking something from the social welfare and leaving, this is what we want to avoid. So therefore, integration policy and social welfare policy are linked together, and is one of the reasons why in social welfare states the integration question is much more pronounced than in the country like you are living.
I can't help myself in articulating my narrow disciplinary consciousness. That Heinz says that we'll know if it's successful if it's off the political agenda, and if it's off, and if businessmen stop complaining about their labor force. In other words, if there's quiescence, docility is the goal. And I would say two things on this. One, you could get docility if, in fact, Europe's economy recovers and becomes a vibrant part of the world economy. You could get that outcome, and you would think it was because of the new policy, when it actually could be because of the changing economic conditions of Europe. So we wouldn't be able to identify the policy as a cause of it being off the agenda, because lots of other things could have gotten it off the agenda. That's point number one. Point number two is we still don't know if that policy is optimal compared to alternatives. And so if you say it got it off the agenda and economic growth because of it was X, a different policy could have gotten it off the agenda with economic policy X plus Y, and we wouldn't know that unless we had a more experimental approach towards policy shift.
Just to add, you painted a fairly positive picture and said then the test is whether it's finally reducing or immigration integration is no longer believing the Hoffnung is here. And then you said we are on a good way. But as you said yourself, this new paradigm means also an even tougher anti-refugee policy. And if we go into the last kind of month or year, we had one of the hottest policy discussions on the refugee, a real Austrian refugee movement by itself taking up the floor and speaking, fairly hot political issue. If we now look into the election campaign for the upcoming national elections, I mean, I would not say it's really much less if you have this next leader, this neighbor, the Austrian neighbor that you whom you should love, kind of taking a strong Christian symbol and even having the Catholic Church strongly reacting. So I am not quite sure where your optimism actually is coming from.
No, my optimism is coming from observation of that election campaign. Very crude words like foreigners should go out, immigration stop, bring all foreigners back to their home countries are disappeared completely. Maybe you say yes, but there is something behind. Sure, there is something behind. I'm quite sure, but from a political party strategy, it would be very unintelligent now to bring the migration issue on the agenda, because we have a decreasing. People are saying from one opinion poll to the other, yes, migration and integration works better than before. This is an objective finding of opinion polls. So there is a relation between political party strategy and the change of the public opinion. Therefore, I'm optimistic.
So we have three papers. We have three papers for the next session. So why don't we take a break so we'll be alive and well for this next session. Thank you very much both for the paper givers and for your